talk to us about the trips that you made while you were at KWS and what your initial findings were, your observations of this sanctuary to which these rhinos were to be moved.
Thank you. The issue about the relocation of the rhinos to the Tsavo East Rhino Sanctuary began in 2016. The proposals to translocate began in 2016. At that time, from the records that I have seen, the board actually rejected the request by management to do the translocation. I got involved in it in August 2017 when the board asked that I accompany another person to go over to Tsavo East to have a view of the sanctuary and come back to the board with the observations and the analysis of the situation. And we flew down to the Tsavos, and when we go to the site, we specifically went around the sanctuary to examine the fence and finally zeroed in on the material issues. The two material issues were availability of feed material, in other words, the plants that rhinos would feed on. And at that time, it was the height of the drought, and the vegetation condition was very poor.
This was in July
This
last
was
year.
in August.
In August last year.
Yes, specifically on 30th of August 2017.
Okay.
And the condition of the food material for rhinos was very poor because this was at the height of an extended drought. We then went to the issue of the water. On the water, we found that 2 boreholes had been sunk into the ground and water was being pumped into 2 water troughs. We examined the water troughs, and the water which was in the water troughs was extremely salty. Looking at it and tasting it with our own mouths, the water was so salty to the extent that I would actually say it would be more than the Mombasa seawater. The closest equivalent I would compare them with is the water condition and the salt condition that you find in Lake Magadi in the Rift Valley. And we checked around the water troughs, the space between, or the area on the ground between, before the walls of the water troughs, and found that there were absolutely no animal footprints.
And what did that tell you?
That actually tells you that the water was not drinkable, even to the animals that have been resident in that area for years. We discussed the issues, and after that, we took what we had discussed to the Board Conservation Committee, and they came up with a recommendation that translocation should not happen until the ecological conditions had been met.
But then you made a second trip to the same site later on in the year. Tell us about that trip, and if you found the conditions perhaps more favorable, or were they the same as, you know, about 6 months before?
Right. We made the second trip after indications from the donor that they were anxious that the project should move forward. So the board, again, through the board chair, asked us to go back and review the ecological status of the place. We went to the place on 20th of September 2017 and went through the process. Now, this time, I decided...
20th of December?
20th of December,
okay.
2017.
Right.
I decided this time to actually capture the scene in a camera video. And we then went around the place. Again, the same situation was prevailing. No footprints around the water troughs, which means that the animals were not using the water. There were no bird droppings, and the water continued to be saline. The key point here is that the water troughs were placed where they were because the rhinos, as soon as they get translocated, have to be kept in pens. So that means they would not be free to move to any other water source if there was within the sanctuary.
So this
That's
was going to be the only source of water that they would have access to?
For the animals that were being translocated.
Okay. So let me understand this, Ambassador. You made a trip in August 2017 to the site, made your recommendations that the area was not suitable for the rhinos.
Right.
You made another trip in December of 2017,
Right.
made the same recommendations in January of this year.
We made the same recommendations to the board committee in January, and at the end of January, there was a board meeting.
Okay.
And those recommendations from the board committee went to the board, and the board maintained the same position.
So
that
twice.
Is the third time now.
This was the third time
there was
that the
one
board
in 2016,
yes,
2 in my presence, and that is where the matter stopped. Sometimes in February.
Yes, let's talk about that now. So 3 times from 2016 up until 2018 January.
Exactly.
Decisions have been made, the same decision.
Consistent.
Consistent.
Yes.
3 times.
Yes.
That the rhinos shouldn't be moved to this sanctuary in Savo
Precisely.
East. What happens thereafter?
There was a meeting of the management and the donor that took place in KWS. And the meeting was to review the condition. There had been a lot of rain since December, and the plant material or the food materials had actually substantially improved at the site. However, the issue of the water had not changed. And the agreement at that meeting was that there is need to do a further analysis, scientific analysis this time, so we get to know actually the units per volume of water and what they would mean to the livestock that could actually use that water.
Right.
From there, things went quiet. We go to March. April, the term of the board expired on the 17th. Up to that point, there was no news, no information about any developments in as far as the rhino translocation was concerned. We went through April, and in June, in as far as I'm concerned, I only learned the day before that there was going to be a translocation on the 26th.
And by this time, your term had expired?
By that time, my term was expiring. I was only left with 3 days to the end of my term.
All right. In your assessment, between the time you made the trip in December, the recommendations in January, the meeting that you talk about in February with the donor, is it possible that the ecological conditions could have changed to now make it possible for these rhinos to survive in Savo East? Could the rains have picked up? Could the source of water have been perhaps changed, an alternative found to make this suitable for these rhinos?
That actually required a verification of a scientific report, that we should actually have had a presentation showing that the parameters had changed.
Did that presentation happen?
No. As far as I'm concerned, up to the time I was leaving KWS, I never got any report that the parameters had changed. And I don't think they have changed.
So having gone through all of this, you hear about the planned translocation a day before. What was your reaction?
It was not actually the planned translocation. It was the actual translocation.
Okay.
And on the morning of the next day, there was all this capturing of rhinos in Aruba Park, which I never even got the opportunity to go to because it was all of a sudden. But that's how it happened. It just came bang, which was not very clear to me why this should happen, because at that time, there was no board, save the chairman who had just been appointed. There was no report at the management level, at least up to the date of my departure, which was actually 29th of June. There was no report whatsoever. And this was very unusual, because the way the decision-making is organized in KWS is that it should pass through those processes. Whether the water analysis
so it should have passed through the subcommittee that was taking a look at it.
It should come to management.
Right.
It should have come to the directorate or the people working with the director general.
Okay.
It should come to the director general's office, and then from there, it would go to the board conservation committee and subsequently to the board itself. This is where those decisions that had been made by the board can then be reviewed.
And who makes that final decision? Who says, yes, let's go ahead with this translocation?
It should actually be the board. And after the board has approved that, then the Director General can execute. That is the way it should happen.
And so at this time that decision was made, there was no board?
There was no board. There was no board.
Let's go back to your reaction.
And there was no board conservation committee, which is a subcommittee of the board.
And so you hear about this translocation and you think, what goes through your mind?
I was actually horrified, because when I recalled how saline the water was, I was actually horrified. I remember the steel, how it had been corroded. I just couldn't imagine what would happen to the rhinos themselves.
But the Cabinet Secretary says that there are board minutes that he has seen approving this translocation at the time you were at the helm, when you were the COO.
Those were the board minutes of November 30th or 31st, and those would be also the minutes of the board meeting of January. Now, those minutes, the approval that you hear of the board is approval of the recommendations of the Board Conservation Committee. The board is a policy organ.
And those recommendations were?
It does not deal with technical issues.
And the recommendations were?
The recommendations were that translocation of rhinos await the availability or the presence of favorable ecological conditions, which is the feed, and the issue of the saline water should be resolved. Those are the two conditions that were very principal. And as far as I'm concerned, the feed got sorted out when the drought ended, but the saline water, which is a very key issue, has not been resolved up to date.
Have you been interviewed by the team that is probing this, that came up with some of the findings that we heard recently? Has anybody spoken to you?
The investigation team did not talk to me. I have not been asked by anybody to comment on this.
Do you find that interesting? 38 years in conservation, having been at the helm, having made the recommendations that you did.
Why they did not find it necessary to interview me as the other alternative person that went to the site, I think it's very odd indeed.
There have been calls for the Cabinet Secretary to step down. In your view, Ambassador, who should take responsibility for what happened in Savo East?
When things like this happen, the buck stops somewhere.
Where does it stop?
And it is the highest office in that structure.
Which would be the Cabinet Secretary?
And then it can come down. You can actually say, at the ministry, you would also go to KWS, who is the top office, and then from there, you can go down to the departments and check it out.